Hello again, sophomores. Welcome back to A Push videos. This is the second one of three that you're going to watch this week. This one is over the New England colonies. So we talked about the southern colonies last time. This is going to be the New England colonies, which is in the what is today northeastern part of the United States. You can see here the major ones. The big ones you need to know are Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth. Those are the big ones. The other ones are important too. We'll talk a little about Rhode Island. Not as much about Connecticut or New Hampshire, but Massachusetts Bay particularly is the largest, the most powerful one that we'll get into. You might have heard of this before if you remember from your 8th grade year. I know it was a long time ago, so maybe you don't remember that. But the big thing with the people who settle the New England colonies, they tend to come over for religious reasons. These were people who either called themselves pilgrims or separatists or the Puritans. These are people who are very similar to each other. They both believe in this idea of predestination, which basically means that God already has determined before you were ever born whether you're going to heaven or hell. So in reality, according to this teaching by John Calvin, it really doesn't matter how good of a person you are or how many good deeds you do on earth, that it was already predetermined. This meant that the Pilgrims and the Puritans who believe in this concept of predestination tend to be very doubtful of themselves because they're always looking for a sign if they can determine for themselves, oh, maybe this shows that I'm really going to heaven. It also makes them very suspicious and paranoid of other people as well, which we'll get back into and talk a little bit later. And the Pilgrims and Puritans not only believe in this idea, but they also really, really hate the Catholic Church, which is an important element we'll talk about in a second. So these are kind of both Pilgrims and the Puritans. They both believe in this idea of predestination from this Calvinistic belief. They do differ in a couple of things. Pilgrims wanted to completely separate from the Church of England. They saw the Church of England as being too Catholic. It had retained too many Catholic traditions. So they wanted to completely break away from the Church of England. That's why they called themselves separatists, because they wanted to separate. Whereas the Puritans, they wanted to purify the Church of England. Not necessarily get rid of it, but just purify it of all those Catholic ideas. The reason why these two are going to be important is not only because a lot of them are going to settle throughout New England, but in particular, the Pilgrims are going to settle Plymouth colony, and then the Puritans are going to settle the Massachusetts Bay colony again, and a lot of the other places as well. So they're very similar to each other. They are different in some key beliefs like this, but they all, again, they all believe in that fundamental idea of the predestination. They also believed in something called the covenant theology, basically that as a person you have a covenant between you and God. A covenant is a fancy way of saying an agreement. The covenant theology, the covenant of grace, was this direct connection you had with God. This is one of the problems that the Puritans/Pilgrims had with Catholicism, is that Catholicism, you had to go through all these different levels, priests, bishops, popes before you get to God, whereas the Puritans and Pilgrims, coming from a more Protestant background, say that really there's no one in between you and God, that you have a more direct connection with God. They also believe in this social covenant, that you have responsibility between you and your community, between how you interact with each other, which meant that, again, you had to be very watchful of your community to make sure that they weren't doing something they weren't supposed to be doing. You also did not tolerate any sort of deviance, any sort of disorder. You did not tolerate other religions or other religious beliefs, which makes it the great irony of the Puritans and the Pilgrims, is that they came over to the New England colonies because they were religiously persecuted by the Church of England in England. And yet when they came over, despite the fact that they were religiously persecuted themselves, they also were extremely dogmatic and refused basically any other religions, refused to believe in any other religions other than their own, and anybody else they would not tolerate. So the Puritans tended to be very intolerant towards basically everybody that wasn't a Puritan. No privacy. Again, you got to be watchful, which meant that everybody was basically pretty paranoid as well. And again, as I said, despite all of this, they ended up being religiously persecuted at home, and then they religiously persecuted anybody else in New England. Plymouth Colony is the first big one that you need to know. This is the one that is established by the Pilgrims. You've heard of this story. I'm not going to go too much into it because you've been taught this story since you were a little kid. The Pilgrims came over. They signed the Mayflower Compact on the ship Mayflower, basically a compact that said how they were going to govern themselves. This is important because it shows, an early form of self-governance, like a group of people coming together and forming their own government, which is going to be, important for later United States stuff. At first, the Pilgrims struggled with survival. They were helped by the Native Americans, which of course leads to the famous Thanksgiving where the Native Americans helped them out. That sounds like a wonderful story. It is nice, but however, the Pilgrims will eventually, go to war with them and take their land. So it is not a happy end of the story. Ultimately, though, the Pilgrim in the Pilgrim experience in Plymouth Colony is going to be, Plymouth Colony itself is going to be absorbed into the larger Massachusetts Bay Colony. So Plymouth, as a colony by itself, will eventually just be kind of put into Massachusetts in general. The key parts of the characteristics of the New England colonies are the Great Migration, which is going to be this 15,000 or so Puritans will leave they'll leave England proper because of a civil war. They will transition they will go to a couple of different places in Europe and then eventually make their way over to New England colonies. Unlike the southern colonies, which had a high mortality rate, life expectancy in the New England colonies was actually pretty high. And that has a lot to do with the fact that the climate's just better. There aren't as many diseases. It's not as hot. So people lived longer in New England. Unlike in the southern colonies where people came over basically as single men, Puritans came over as families. So whole generations of families, uncles, aunts, fathers, mothers, grandparents, like everybody came over together. And when they came over together, they settled together. So unlike the southern colonies, there were a lot more towns in New England. Towns were really important. Education tended to be more important in those towns. There were a lot more schools, churches, and a limited form of democracy. There was the ability to vote in those towns. The towns themselves would vote on certain things that are going to happen in the town. So we see a limited form of democracy. However, it's, again, much like the southern colonies, it's not a very full democracy. You had to be white, male, landowning, and a member of the church. So not super democratic, but again, those seeds of what we see later on, we see the seeds of that starting here. Religiously based, the society, however, one of the things they did believe in is the separation of church and state. They thought that the clergy, which means that people were, the pastors, the preachers, they should not serve in the government. So they did believe in a separation of church and state. Again, limited power for women, which we'll talk about later on. The climate of New England, not really conducive for large-scale agriculture, plantation farming like in the South, tobaccos and large fields. So the farming that happened in New England was going to be much more smaller scale, much more for for food and for you to feed yourself and your community. So that meant that there wasn't the level of African slavery that we would see in other colonies. However, really important to know this because people get this wrong all the time. There was still some African slavery in New England. One of the things you'll hear me talk about is that there was slavery everywhere, not just in one single place. And then the last one on here, since the economy is not based on a cash crop like it is in the southern colonies, it's based on things like trade, shipbuilding, and fishing. That was mainly how the Puritans in New England made money. One of the first people to know about it is a guy named John Winthrop. John Winthrop was the first governor of Massachusetts. The big thing to know about him, he's a long-term serving governor of Massachusetts. He's obviously a Puritan, but he gave a sermon called A Model of Christian Charity, where he very famously compared this Puritan experiment in New England to a city upon a hill where all the world is looking upon it. Basically trying to say that Puritan New England is going to be a shining example for the world to follow. So you can already see this kind of idea of what we will later call American exceptionalism. A lot of politicians still love to use the term city upon a hill to describe the United States. So this kind of early form of we see ourselves as being an example for others to follow. However, there were a group of people within the Puritans who didn't always like to be told what to do. There were a number of Puritans who rebelled against the authority of the church. A couple of them that I want you to know was one by the name of Roger Williams. He was a young minister who argued that really, and this is a pretty forward-thinking thing at the time, he argued that there should be no one in the government telling you what your religion is, that it was not the role of the government to tell people what they should believe. He also believed, and this, again, is a pretty crazy idea for this time period, he also believed that the Puritans had not been fair to the Native Americans, had taken their land and not given them fair compensation. So he rebelled against the Puritan authority of of the New England, of Massachusetts Bay Colony. And for that, in 1635, he was exiled for his dangerous opinions. He's going to, a year later, he's going to exile, meaning he's forced out of Massachusetts Bay Colony. He's going to make his way south, and he's going to form a new colony of his own called Rhode Island. And this place will be one of the most liberal places in the world for the 1600s, for really, actually for the next several hundred years. It will believe in religious toleration for all, like not just Christians, but for even Jewish people as well. It also, because again, Roger Williams believed that they had unfairly treated Native Americans. Rhode Island will also be a place where Puritans and Native Americans could live side by side without killing each other. Again, this is a pretty liberal idea, something that doesn't exist really in many places in the 1600s and isn't going to exist many places even in the United States for another like 300 plus years. So it's pretty insane that Roger Williams was able to create such a kind of forward-thinking place, a more modern thinking place, considering that a lot of places won't have that for many, many centuries to come. Another Puritan rebel who also defied the Puritan church was a woman named Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson really was like, actually, she was like a Puritan of all Puritans. She didn't necessarily agree with Puritans. She was like more Puritan than other Puritans. And she criticized other Puritans for not being so Puritan. So she was basically going against the authority of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the men who controlled the Massachusetts Bay Colony, by saying, you guys aren't being Puritan enough. Puritans believe that only faith can get you to heaven, not good deeds. And too many Puritans, she said, she looked around at the men of the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and said, too many of you believe in these things. So they exiled her. They didn't exile her just for her beliefs. They exiled her in large part because this was a woman who dared to question the authority of the men in power, to dare to question the patriarchal authority of the men in power. So she too will be exiled for her beliefs, in large part because of the fact that she was a woman. Unfortunately for her, unlike Roger Williams, she will try to make her way to Rhode Island. She will live there for a little while, but eventually she's going to be killed in a Native American attack, unfortunately. And John Winthrop, that guy I told you that was a governor, he's going to basically clap and say, see, this is God's will. See, God wanted this because this woman dared to defy us, which leads to this concept within New England and understanding Puritan ideology as very much a patriarchal society, very much controlled by the men. The male not only control, the males not only control the government, they also control the household, they also control the churches as well. So women were expected to be subordinate to men, to do what men told them to do. They were not allowed to, once they got married, to sign a contract. They were not allowed to own property. In fact, actually, weirdly enough, women in the southern colonies actually had more rights than women in New England. Women in the southern colonies had to be able to sign contracts and own property, because if you remember, I told you in the southern colonies, the death rate was really high. So it was not uncommon for a man to die in the southern colonies, and then the woman would have to take charge of the household. However, in New England, women had even less power, which is not something we think of. We think of, oh, the southern colonies must be much more backwards. But in reality, women had at least a little bit more power in the southern colonies than they did in New England. So not a lot of power for these women, which leads to one of the most infamous incidences in Puritan New England, one you have probably heard of because you have been in a class with Miss G, and that is what happens in Salem with the Salem witch trials in 1692. Not only was this a legitimate fear of witchcraft, because this is a thing that's happening in other parts of the world as well, as these people do believe in witchcraft and they do believe this is a real thing, but it's not a coincidence that this was targeted towards women, that women were seen as weak and unable to stop the influences of the devil. Also, this was targeted towards lower class women. It's not a coincidence that most of the women that were accused of witchcraft tended to come from the lower class part of the town of Salem. So there was also a social element, not just a gendered element to this, but also a class element as well. Again, there's whole stories behind all of this, but a lot of it came down to patriarchy. A lot of it came down to social class. A lot of it just came down to money. People gain something. If you could accuse a neighbor of being a witch, then that person might, lose their life and be killed for that. And then, oh, there's a nice little land that I can take from my neighbor and take that person's land for my own. So people stood to gain financial benefit from accusing others. And this created a sense of paranoia within the town, which would eat the town alive pretty much until it kind of all stopped in about a year later. But by that point, the damage had been done. This also then kind of relates to something called the halfway covenant. This is a kind of complicated term and topic, so I'm going to try to make it make as much sense as possible for you. Essentially, in order to be a full member of the Puritan Church, you had to have a religious conversion, a religious experience, basically an experience with God. However, as time went on, less and less young people were having these religious conversions, these experiences. So the membership of the Puritan Church was actually declining. There was less and less full members of the church. So in order to try to get more people to be members of the church, basically they kind of the Puritan church leaders created a cheat called the halfway covenant that said, well, you could still be a member of the church without having a full conversion, which again is basically a cheat because they're losing members. They're not only losing members just because of less people having these conversions, but they're also losing members because as time goes on, as the years go on, more and more of these young people are less religious in their beliefs, and they're more concerned with economic and financial gain, whether that's making money in shipbuilding or fishing. So as the colony grew and as it grew more financially prosperous, that meant a lot of the people, the religious energy that people came over in the first place was kind of dying out. So this is the Puritans' kind of last ditch effort to try to get more people to join the Puritan Church. And the last part I want you to know about is how do the Puritans interact with Native Americans? And as the story is going to be with every other place we've talked about, the answer is really simply not good. The Puritans saw the Native Americans as a stumbling block, as a roadblock to take the land away from them. So not only were many Native Americans wiped out, 3/4 of the population is going to be wiped out just from diseases, but there's going to be a series of wars that happen between the Puritans and the Native Americans, the Pequot Wars in 1634 to 1638. Which is going to lead to the creation of something called the New England Confederation. This is where those different New England colonies, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, are going to try to temporarily form a military alliance to defend themselves against Native Americans. The reason why this is a big deal and why I want you to know this is because, again, these are different colonies coming together to defend themselves, but this shows that that's something that's going to have to happen later on. We're going to see different colonies putting aside differences and forming alliances when we talk about, eventually the American Revolution. The last major thing you need to know for this lesson is the last major Native American war with the Puritans. This is often referred to as King Philip's War. King Philip was a Native American. His real name was Metacom, but because probably most likely racism, instead of actually using his real name, the Puritans just called him King Philip, but his name was Metacom. This is a war between 1675 and 1676 that will see a number of major battles happen within New England. About 12 New England towns are going to be destroyed in this Native American War, the King Philip's War. The big thing, though, to know about this is that ultimately King Philip and Metacom himself, they're going to lose this war. But this is also going to show that really this is the last major significant Native American threat to Puritan New England. By this point, Native Americans in New England are either dead from diseases or battles, or they're going to leave and move westward to get out of there. So King Philip's War, Metacom's War, significance is that this is really the last major time that Native Americans are able to resist in New England before no longer being able to do so. Okay, guys, that is it. So thank you. I appreciate you guys, and I will see you when I see you.